Hello and welcome to the Classics podcast, There's Virgil's Aeneid, with me, Caroline Lawrence.
And me, Katrina Kelly. This is the podcast where we explore the intricacies of Virgil's verse and debate the ambiguity and complexities. Last week we discussed all about the word pietas, and we explored Aeneas's piety. Is he a faithful, dutiful hero, or is he in fact a traitor? Plot twist. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and thank you so much for coming back and joining us for episode 9 of the series. Now, this week's word of the day is perhaps one of the first that if you've ever learned Latin, you learned early on, and one that non-Latinists might know as well. What is our word of the day, Caroline?
Our word of the day is pater, or pater, as they sometimes say, but we'll say pater. How do you decline pater, Katrina?
So it's third declension, masculine noun. So, pater, pater, patrem, patris, patri, patre. In the plural, we can have plural fathers. Patres, 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 patrum, patribus, patribus.
Yeah, and it means father, and it's linked to the word patria, fatherland, or native land, or country, your own country. And both words follow on really nicely from last week's episode from the word pietas, because we saw that pietas was the concept and indeed sometimes the goddess of devotion to the gods, your country, and your family. Now, in the Roman world, the family was very important, and the father was of supreme importance. And I think I'm right in saying that a father had the power of life and death over his children, even when they were adults. Is that right, Katrina?
It is, and if we go all the way back to the 6th century BC, so to remember Brutus, now this is not Etu Brutus, that guy, not the guy that killed Caesar, it is Lucius Junius Brutus, who's credited as being the founder of the Roman Republic. And there's an amazing painting. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll be seeing it on the screen right now. Painted during the era of the French Revolution, and it shows him contemplating the fate of his sons, because his two sons conspired to overthrow the Republic and restore the monarchy, and so Brutus had this terrible decision to make, and he decided to order their deaths. In so doing, he became a heroic defender of the Republic, but at the cost of his own family. Not quite as drastic, but perhaps a good parallel there we can draw with Aeneas. And on the left side of this painting, the father sits there brooding in the darkness, and he can't really even look at the lictors. Those are the people that kind of bodyguards that looked after the consul, as they bring in the bodies of his sons. And then on the right-hand side of the paintings, you've got his wife and his daughters, and they're really sort of lit up so that the painting's focus is upon their grief and agony.
Yeah, that painting by David is apparently I think it's massive. It's huge. It takes up a whole wall. It's in the Louvre. So it's a fantastic painting, and the dark and the light and the drama. And that particular Brutus appears to Aeneas in the scene in the underworld where Aeneas's dead father Anchises shows him souls that will be reborn as great men. And in Latin, vis et tarquinios reges animamque superbam ultores bruti fascesque videre receptos consulis imperium hic primus savasque secures accipiet natosque pater nova bella moventes ad poenam pulchra pro libertate vocabit. And I'm going to go to Dryden. Or do you want to read the Dryden translation there?
Trusty old Dryden. Next view the Tarquin Quins, the avenging sword of Brutus justly drawn and Rome restored. He first renews the rods and axe severe, and gives the consuls royal robes to wear. His sons who seek the tyrant to sustain, and long for arbitrary lords again. With ignominy scourged in open sight, he doomed to death deserved, asserting public right. Unhappy man to break the pious laws of nature, pleading in his children's cause. However the doubtful fact is understood, its love of honour and his country's good, the consul, not the father, sheds the blood.
Strong stuff there. Strong stuff. And notice that in this case, the pietas, it's against the law of nature almost, isn't it? And it's towards the patria. It's devotion to the fatherland, or perhaps you could say the government, is even more important than devotion to your son, your father as a father. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
hard
a
stuff.
striking line, that, isn't it? The consul, not the father, sheds the blood. The fact you
Yeah,
can have these multiple personae and you've got to choose one. And I suppose Aeneas is there as father to his people, but he's also there as the dux, as the leader,
mhm.
and he's got to prioritize, I suppose, the group that he's taking with him rather than just his own son at any point.
And do we think? I think fathers were more important in Roman times than even Greek times. Would you agree?
I think so. I mean, you can view it from a slightly different perspective and see it from the kind of legal position of Roman women, and how even, as you say, in adulthood they would be under the guardianship of the male in their family. There's a brilliant book by Jane F. Gardner all about kind of Roman law and how that applied to women, but it really does emphasise, although there could be a mater familias, a mother at the head of the family if there weren't a male, the pater familias, the father of the family, is the hugely important figure in Roman society on so many different levels.
Yeah, and Virgil does mention mothers in some of his similes and a few little places. We'll maybe get onto that. But the father son, that's the strong, powerful theme, isn't it? And there's so many tragic instances, aren't there, of the father son?
Yeah, there are. And actually, yeah, you're right. In the Odyssey, Odysseus summons his mum from the underworld, whereas Aeneas visits his father. And we won't necessarily talk today, but we don't want to underplay the importance of Venus in this poem. And of course, that gives us the link to Augustus, doesn't it? Because he claimed direct lineage to the goddess, to Venus, to prove that he was only one step away from divinity himself. And the Aeneid is, in a sense, a sort of genealogical tract for Augustus via Aeneas all the way back to Venus. So we can't forget her. But you're right, if we think of some of these kind of father-son tragedies that happen, there are an awful lot, aren't there? So Priam sees his youngest son, Polites, slain at the altar by Neoptolemus, son indeed of Achilles. Daedalus tries to stop the fall of his son Icarus and can't do it, and so deep is his grief that comes in there. There's a wonderful simile, we love similes, at the start of book 6. Then skip forward a bit, we've got Ollivander, the king of Proto-Rome, who faints at the mere thought of his doomed son Pallas dying, and of course Pallas does die, spoilers, in his very first battle. And we've then got Virgil evoking pity for the cruel Etruscan Mezantius, who's totally undone by the death of his noble son Lausus. Danaus, the father of Turnus, he's going to lose his son as well. And then this doesn't just affect humans, it does affect the gods as well. And even Jupiter comforts his son Heracles when Pallas is about to die, reminding him that he, king of the gods, could do nothing to save his own son Sarpedon. So there's a lot of tragedy. It's not as though these relationships are all bound in power and success and glory through the generations. There's a lot of sorrow there too.
Yeah, yeah. And Owen Lee, who's become a familiar name now on this podcast, he says that of all the sons in the poem, only the hero's flesh and blood son Ascanius survives. So that's quite shocking. There are all these fathers and sons, but the sons die young, and that's really tragic, isn't it?
Yeah, and there was lots of tragedy in Augustus's own family, with his own grandchildren, nephew, dying young. So I suppose that would have been a particularly poignant theme to pick out. Although in a way, it only really matters that Ascanius survives, doesn't it? He becomes Iulus, he becomes the father of the Julian race, hence the Julian family that brings us Augustus. So that link has to survive. One of them has to, doesn't it, to create this future. But I think there's a nice moment of consolation in book 6, in the underworld section, when Anchises shows Aeneas all these souls buzzing like bees in the fields of Elysium. And he says, Has equidem memorare tibia querastendere coram, iam pridem hanc poelum cupio innumerem meorum, quo magis Italia mecum laetera reperta. And that is line 6716 onwards. I'll do a little bit of Dryden. I think we'll go with Dryden again to translate those lines. Long has my soul desired this time and place, to set before your sight your glorious race, that this presaging joy may fire your mind to seek the shores by destiny designed.
Yeah, so he's saying bees. Remember, bees. Virgil loves bees. They're always good. So your ancestors, your descendants will be as many as the bees. So hang on in there, son, which is nice. Um, and it's a kind of encouragement, yeah, that Aeneas's self-denial will end in a crop of great descendants. And that passage also reminds us that of the fathers and sons, for Aeneas at least, the closest one is between Aeneas and his father, much more so than Aeneas and his son Ascanius.
Yeah, it's a bit weird, isn't it? We've just said that the whole thing depends upon his survival and his future. That's why this book exists, right? But actually, in a way, it's a positive aspect of Aeneas's character. We talked about in our Dido episode, she falls in love with him via Ascanius and via his love for Ascanius. But it's weird that the relationship doesn't take up that many lines. We don't really see them together very much, and there's only once that Aeneas speaks directly to Ascanius, when he awkwardly kisses him through his helmet and gives him some words of advice. Disce puer tutum ex me verum que laborem, fortunam per aliis.
Yeah, and that there are at least three words in that short passage that are slightly tricky for us and have slightly different meanings. So here's how I translated that passage. My boy, learn courage. Virtus is more of a manly courage than like virtue, and true pain, that's labora, from me, but happiness from others. So he's saying, learn courage and pain from me, but happiness from others. Here's Aeneas, our poster boy for melancholy temperament. And M. Owen Lee offers this version: learn from me, my boy, what it is to be a man and to suffer. Learn from others what it is to be happy. What encouraging words to your son.
I know. I guess it's meant to evoke the famous scene in the Iliad when little Astyanax is frightened by the helmet and the feathers that his father Hector is wearing. It gives us that nice contrast. But then, of course, the point of that is that they're all doomed to die. Hector's doomed to die, and Astyanax will be thrown off the Towers of Troy. So it's not good. Either way.
And also in that passage, Astyanax is like maybe a year old, or he's just a little baby, and it's almost as if in the Aeneid, Virgil isn't quite sure how little kids worked. I suspect it's because he had no experience of them, and that may be one reason why Ascanius is so strangely depicted, because he's at one minute he's being cuddled on the lap of Dido, and the next he's riding off on a hunt praying for a foaming boar or a lion to kill. So Virgil obviously draws on his own experience, or rather lack of it, I think. And of course, it's said that he never married or had children. It is frustrating how little we know about him. And I think that's why so many Virgil scholars or fans of Virgil throughout the ages have tried to figure out about Virgil's life by clues from the Aeneid. And I think that actually makes sense, because as a writer, I know that I reveal far more of myself in my fiction than I ever would if I wrote like an autobiography or a little blurb, because I'd curate that blurb. But you let things about your inner philosophy and thoughts and memories slip out in fiction. So I think that's totally fair, to kind of think about Virgil's life and what his own family was like, maybe.
That's really interesting. Are there any of your books in particular that we might find more of you in, or a character?
Well, one thing, this is kind of slightly off track, and I don't know if it supports my argument, but when I wrote my Roman Mysteries, there's no mother in it. And I have her father who's slightly absent-minded and stuff. And my mother once slightly painfully asked me, why did you kill off the mother in the books? And I said, well, kids' books, you can't have the parents, or at least only one maybe. But I said, but also, I said, you and I have a great relationship. I don't have anything I need to work through. But I had a more tempestuous relationship with my father, who's, by the way, nothing like Marcus Flavius Geminus. So I needed
That's
to
a
work.
very diplomatic answer. You're too good that I couldn't bring you into the books.
I mean, it's like in a story, always watch out if a character's perfect. The writer's going to have to kill them off because there's no arc for them. There's nowhere for them to go unless they're a traveling angel like Paddington Bear or maybe Aeneas. Anyway, but
A quick word then for mothers, whilst we're on the topic.
I'm probably not the first to suspect that Virgil had issues with his mother. And my current theory, this is just my theory, is that his mother was probably very young when she had him, and probably as a result, maybe was quite frivolous and a bit neglectful. And one of Virgil's most famously quoted lines is Aeneid 4, 5, 6, 9, when Mercury tells Aeneas to skedaddle because Dido is a real threat. You know that famous line, don't you?
Yes, of course. Varium et mutabile semper femina. Woman is an ever-changeable and inconsistent thing.
And literally a changeable thing and an inconsistent thing. Neuter adjectives is, and then you wait for the enjambment, a woman. So whenever you get like a line in Virgil and then the kind of punchline comes down as one word below, and the beginning of the next line, that's enjambment. That's often the little kicker. So a strange thing and changeable is ... a woman. So and I especially think of Aeneas's plaintive plea to his mother, who in the Aeneid first appears to him disguised as a kind of sexy huntress in a little mini tunic with her hair down, which is shocking for Romans, and only reveals her true identity when departing. Do you want to read that passage?
Sure. Dixit, et advertens Rosea curve fulsit, ambrosiaeque cumae divinum vertice odorum spirere, pedes vestis defluxit adimos, et vera incesso patuit dea, ille ubi matre magnovit, talia fugentimis voce secutus. Quid natum totiens, credelis tu quoque, falsis ludis imaginibus, que dextrae jungera dextram non datur, ad veras auderit redera voces. When she finished speaking, she turned and glowed with the pink nape of her neck, and her ambrosial hair sent out the scent of divinity from her head, and her short garment flowed down to the soles of her feet, and she showed her true nature as a goddess by her movement.
Can't
And
you
then
just see her? Can't you just see her flipping her hair and kind of flouncing off, and you can almost catch a waft of the scent of roses, although we don't know what ambrosia smells like. That's the food of the gods and the drink of the gods. But the rosy glow subliminally suggests rose oil, one of the most expensive and heady perfumes. And when poor Aeneas recognized his mother, notice that word is enjambed again, the agnovet. He recognized, that's a little punch. It's her as she's going off. When he recognizes her, he follows her with this speech: "You are a cruel creature. Why do you so often tease your son with false appearances? Why isn't it allowed for me to clasp your right hand with mine and for us to listen and speak with our true voices?" Poor Aeneas. Can you think of any other glamorous and neglectful mothers in literature or film, Katrina?
And the one that came to mind was stalwart of my childhood was Tracy Beaker, the Jacqueline Wilson, well, TV series and the novels as well, where she is in an orphanage, doesn't necessarily know who her mum is, but she has these visions of her being this very glamorous person who is neglectful and goes off to live this starry lifestyle, and occasionally will come back and see her and rescue her. But a similar sense of her being a cruel creature and somebody that can't be trusted or relied upon. And I suppose that's what you get with a goddess, with Venus.
Yeah, and I mean, this is just ad lib, but remember Absolutely Fabulous? They're both glamorous, and one of them, I think it's the Joanna Lumley character, has a daughter who's like super straight-laced and dutiful, and it's kind of like you get the contrast between the flighty mum and the dutiful child. There's often a switch, but it was the standard of the time for girls to marry really young, often as soon as they hit puberty, and to a man in their 20s, 30s, or even 40s. Could marry a girl as young as 12, which is kind of shocking. And I think that Virgil's father probably made great sacrifices to ensure that his talented son was properly educated and raised, and that Virgil and his father organized him a patron and made sure he went to, I think first he studied in was it Milan and then Rome, anyway. And one thing that strikes me about Aeneas's relationship with Anchises, to go back to the fictional character Virgil created, is that his dad, Anchises, often gets it completely wrong, but Aeneas never blames him, not even a hint of resentment. For example, Anchises misinterprets an oracle which causes them to waste a whole year in Crete and suffer plague, and some of them die and stuff, and it's like delayed their quest by a year. But worst of all is his dad's panic when they're fleeing Troy that makes Aeneas lose his wife Creusa. But there's never any resentment. Not only does he not blame him, but he literally goes to hell to get some final words of advice from his father, even after all those blunders. So I kind of get a gut feeling that Virgil was hugely grateful to his father, who maybe died before he saw his son's success.
Yeah, if there was one person I could have for my fictional dinner party, I think it would be Virgil, just to ask him some of these questions, not least about the Aeneid and what he was aiming to achieve and how he did it, but these family things too would be so interesting. Um,
Absolutely.
but talking of our last week's theme, which was to do with the celebrity traitors, of having that kind of that older sage person who actually gets everything wrong but is still loved and not blamed. I think that was Celia. She was so wonderful, and had her own theories, but every week would come up with something completely different, and it was invariably wrong. But that was a delightful thing, and to see people just absolutely falling in love with her.
And no one ever blamed her, even though she never got much right. She's just such a charming personality, wasn't she? I guess. And Anchises, don't forget, he was a beautiful young man, so beautiful that Venus fell in love with him. And I think he's probably still very good looking and attractive, even though old. I'm very
That's
superficial, so.
That's true, and he wouldn't have been that old either, would he? I think it's very much seeing it in the ancient eyes of old. He's obviously got a grandson, but
I've done a whole thing of how old they all were. And I think he was in his late 50s or 60s, which today isn't old, but that's old in those days. But Aeneas is in his 40s here. Definitely,
yeah.
I think. We'll do
Okay,
the exact dating in a future episode as a bonus, maybe. Yeah.
okay, I look forward to it. So, with each of our jump off words, we have been vaguely linking to a different book of the Aeneid, and I think book 10 is our link book for this week with Pater, because the book itself starts with the father of the gods, Jupiter, calling a council. And then the rest of it mainly is between two fathers on opposing sides who losing exceptional sons in one way or another, violently and tragically. We've already mentioned Pallas very briefly, whose old father fainted at the thought of him going off to fight, and Aeneas kills beautiful young Lausus, noble son of the wicked Mezentius, as well.
Yeah, and I think that we should now talk about this elephant in the room, which is Virgil's own upbringing during this terrible civil war. And almost every commentator I've ever read, and indeed, when you read it yourself, you feel the sadness that permeates the Aeneid. And Homer is very sensitive and powerful when he describes the deaths of young warriors, but in Virgil, you really sense something personal. And I wondered if you could just say a little about the period in which Virgil grew up.
Yes, I mean, there's so much we could say, and it's a very turbulent and indeed famous part of history. But if we go to 43 BCE, so that's a year after the assassination of Julius Caesar, his young nephew, Octavian, the future Augustus, remember he changed his name, formed a coalition with a man called Lepidus and a man called Mark Antony. And they formed a triumvirate. It wasn't the first. There's an earlier triumvirate with Caesar involved himself, Pompey and Crassus as well. So this is known as the second triumvirate. And it's the year of the so-called first proscriptions, and when these three men ordered a purge, essentially, of their enemies and an execution of all of those people involved in Caesar's assassination. Again, this wasn't completely new. There was an earlier time of fear and proscriptions by a dictator called Sulla, about 50, 60 years previously. But Appian, who's a 2nd century AD historian writing in Greek, tells us about some of the horrors of the proscriptions. So he demands, for example, the heads of traitors be brought to them for a cash reward. I'll now read a bit from Appian himself. Straight away through city and country, wherever each one happened to be found, there were sudden arrests and murder in various forms, decapitations for the sake of the rewards when the head should be shown, also undignified flights and strange costumes of persons hitherto well dressed. Some descended into wells, others into underground sewers full of filth. Some took refuge in smoky vaults. Others crouched in the deepest silence under the thick-set tiles of their roofs. Some were not less fearful of their wives and ill-disposed children than of the murderers. Others feared their freedmen and their slaves, creditors feared their debtors, and neighbours feared neighbours who coveted their lands. That's from Book 4, 3:13. So Appian is emphasising how shocking these terrible murders were, because there were so many of them, and in some ways they were quite indiscriminate. Suicides and betrayals, and the apparent dignity of the perpetrators is also what was threatening to them. These weren't your typical criminals, what you might say. These are people in the height of politics. And he says, well, the matters we are now considering are the more remarkable by reason of the dignity of the triumvirs, and especially of one of them, who, by means of his character and good fortune, established the government on a firm foundation, and left his lineage and name to those who now rule after him.
Oh, that last bit obviously refers to Augustus, Octavian Augustus, but obliquely, even though he's been dead for over a century, I guess because the Caesars are still in power. But that's amazing, yeah.
Yeah, it proves how dangerous, tricky it was still to maybe speak ill of Augustus and then the Julio-Claudians all that time later, you're right.
100 years.
Because he is writing with hindsight. This obviously isn't a contemporary account. But he does go on to list some of the worst assassinations, many of which were especially hard on fathers and sons. There were more instances, though, I suppose, of noble willingness to die for a relative. So it may indirectly have brought some families closer together, if at the same time it was tearing others apart. Cicero, his brother and nephew, had also been proscribed, and when they were captured, each of them begged to be killed first. As Appian says, the murderers said they would grant both requests, and dividing themselves into two parties, each taking one, killed them at the same time, according to the agreement. Not nice. Another historian, Suetonius, tells us how Octavian vowed to kill anyone involved in his uncle's death, and when he deemed this accomplished, he built a temple to Apollo on the Palatine Hill, and also vowed to build a temple to Mars Ultor, that's Mars the Avenger, which goes to show just how closely, in a way, piety and furor can be linked, because here Octavian feels that he is performing acts of rightful vengeance and linking them to the gods, even if we might be thinking, that these are sort of heinous crimes.
Yeah, and this is the man who asked our gentle poet Virgil to write a poem in praise of his new government, and Virgil had seen all these terrible things happen.
Yeah, so Virgil would have been about 27 when the proscriptions were issued, and 15 years later, he's about 42, he was asked to potentially write this work that gives legitimacy to one of the perpetrators, to Octavian. So at this point, Octavian or Augustus had been in power for about 10 years and seemed to be ruling wisely, but no one could know how long this rule as the first emperor, the self-appointed emperor, would last, or when he might resort to terror tactics again in order to keep his position.
Yeah. It's easy for us in retrospect to know that Augustus ushered in a golden age of the Pax Romana, but they didn't know that then. We have to keep remembering that. And apparently Virgil wasn't Augustus's first choice as the poet to write his panegyric, a poem in praise of him and his new government, his new rule. But he asked both Horace and Propertius, but they both turned him down. And you can kind of understand their reluctance. They had all witnessed the appalling crimes of so-called civilized politicians and dignified triumvirs, and now one of them wants them to present him in a powerful medium, poetry, epic poetry, as a heroic savior of the Roman patria or fatherland. But Virgil had a clever idea. Instead of writing a straight panegyric, he thought he would write about Augustus's distant ancestor, the Homeric hero Aeneas, and that would make it both heroic, but also give some distance to the still painful events of their current life and of Augustus's accession. And this raises one of the biggest questions about the Aeneid that scholars ask. Was it purely a brilliantly written piece of propaganda, or was it subtly warning Romans about the new regime? In other words, was it pro-Augustan or anti-Augustan? Now, in the 20th century, which you might just about remember, Katrina, a few Virgil scholars suggested that although the Aeneid seems pro-Augustus, it's actually anti-Augustus. And all the subtle ambiguity and the kind of sadness we've been noticing was a way of calling into question many of the deeds and actions of Augustus via the character of Aeneas. A scholar named Brooks Otis, who's apparently super famous, was one of the first of the 20th century scholars to argue that Virgil is pro-Augustus. And he says that when Aeneas emerges from the underworld at the end of Book 6, he is no longer looking back at what he lost, but rather at the future. He's now willing to embrace his destiny, including the philosophy his father urged, parcere subjectis et debellare superbos, Virgil 6:853, to show mercy to those who submit and to pound the proud, or debellare superbus, to battle down the proud, the arrogant. And what makes this stance pro-Augustan is that Aeneas is clearly an alter ego of Augustus. Would you agree?
Well, I'd say so, yeah. The clearest link between them is in the pater imagery. So Augustus clearly cultivated this via his religion, presenting himself as the father of new religious cults as well around the city of Rome, via his Res Gestae, his sort of semi-autobiography where he just says all the brilliant and wonderful things that he's done, via his largesses, providing his subject with grain doles, new temples, etc., etc., anything to secure legitimacy and present himself as the saviour of the Republic, as you said. At the same time as establishing something new, he does it very subtly, very cleverly. He's establishing this principate where he's the prima inter pares, first among equals, and he'd be pleased, I think, to be matched to Pater Aeneas, just the same as Pius Aeneas. But we must remember that Augustus only called himself Pater Patriae, this kind of honorific title, from 2 BC onwards, so that's well after the poem, well after Virgil's death. So the Pater link between the two wasn't a reflection of contemporary society yet, maybe though it did influence Augustus, give him ammunition for being able to call himself that, and being Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland, was a metaphor for political authority, and it's based, Cicero also had this same title, which he gleefully gave to himself after his role in the Catilinarian conspiracy. Does Augustus, though, want to be displaying the hesitancy that Aeneas does? That's what I'd say. We talk a lot about Aeneas being quite human and him being emotional, but would Augustus have really wanted to tap into that?
Yeah, and that's again the pro-Augustan scholars claim that yes, even his hesitation shows his piety, because at first he hesitates, and I think we'll talk about this in the next episode, but at first he hesitates to show that he is remembering what Anchises said, but then he also has a duty to the father of dead Pallas to avenge his death. So he's almost hesitating between two types of piety, which is what Brooks Otis and the pro-Augustinian scholars would argue, and they would say that we find it strange, but that the Romans of the day would have understood and accepted and praised Aeneas's actions, including his abandonment of Dido and everything. They would have understood that, and that the reason we question it is because we're living in a different century. But other scholars in the 1960s argue that Aeneas seems to have learned nothing in the underworld, and moreover, he leaves through the gates of false dreams, hinting that he will never achieve the ideals set out for him, and by association, then neither will Augustus. So we get in the 60s, these two camps of Augustan scholars kind of having a little quarrel. And Brooks Otis and his followers were called the Optimists, or alternatively the European school, and they claim the Aeneid is a celebration of empire, whereas A. Boyle and W.R. Johnson and others called themselves the Pessimists, and they were also known as the Harvard School, and they argue that the Aeneid subverts and criticizes many aspects of Aeneas's behavior and of the vision of future Rome, and by association, Augustus's new empire. So I'd never heard of the Optimists and the Pessimists. Had you heard of that before?
A little bit, and actually, I think historiography and literary criticism are so fascinating, aren't they, in their own right? Because they're affected by contemporary politics, and so these discussions about empire in particular and colonialism have really shaped then these interpretations of the optimistic and the pessimistic interpretations.
Yeah, well, I'd never heard of it. And then I started reading more, including a book by one of the founding pessimists. I mentioned W.R. Johnson, the book called Darkness Visible, which, to be honest, I could not get my head around. I admitted it was brilliant, but he made statements such as, to my mind, a clearness of the unclear is characteristic of Virgil's art.
Very clear.
Anyway, so the pessimists argue that the Roman readers of Virgil's day weren't just blithely accepting it and swallowing it as a work of pro-Augustan propaganda, but that they also picked up on the subversive elements as we do. So we're running low on time, but I just want to highlight a few of the ambiguities that we may not yet have mentioned that subvert the positive view of Aeneas/Augustus. One is the golden bough. Remember, that should have come away easily, but it resists or hesitates. In the Latin, corripit Aeneas ex templo avidusque refringit cunctantem et vatis portat subtecta Sibyllae. The word cunctatem hesitates. That appears in a few other subversive passages. Aeneas then returns from the underworld through the ivory gate of false dreams, not the bone gate of truth. Every element of the shield, and we could maybe do a whole bonus episode later on that. Every element of the shield has a darker underside if you dig deeper. For example, Romulus and Remus are shown being licked into shape by the she-wolf, but we know later on one of them will murder the other. Robert Gerval, a scholar, has written a whole book about this, showing how every element has a darker side if you just think about it. For example, there's a judge named Cato on the shield, who's probably the same Cato who later committed suicide rather than live under the tyrant Julius Caesar. Aeneas then slaughters a dozen Latins over the grave of Pallas, his surrogate son. This was apparently an imitation of a passage in the Iliad where Achilles sacrifices youths at the tumulus of Patroclus, but it's still abhorrent. And the most ambiguous and shocking element of the whole Aeneid is without a doubt the violent ending, which is so abrupt that some scholars believe it proof that Virgil had not quite finished his epic poem. And whole articles, maybe even books, have been written about it. And I'd love for us to discuss that too.
Indeed. And so perhaps that is what we can return to next week.
Sounds good, because I do want to delve a little bit deeper into the ambiguity, and I also want to talk about one of the Harvard pessimists who wrote a groundbreaking article that might bring you to tears. And that's fitting, as our word for next week will be lacrimae, tears.
Lacrimae, bring your tissues. We promise not to make the episodes too sad, but I think it will really highlight the beauty of Virgil's poetry, because although today we've had more of a discussion about the politics and the context and character, we'll be diving even closer into his verse next week. Thank you so much for joining us on the Classics Podcast. Please like, subscribe, give us a follow, write in the comments, tell us some of your favourite examples of Virgil's writing, and please come back and join us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.